My name is Jade Aura. I'm 36 years old, and for most of my adult life, I have been known as the steady one, the calm wife, the reasonable voice, the woman who doesn't overreact. I live in a quiet neighborhood where the lawns are trimmed on Sundays, and the neighbors wave politely from their driveways. From the outside, my life has always looked correct: a stable marriage, a well kept home, a career that never made headlines but paid its bills on time. People tend to underestimate women like me. They see composure and assume compliance. They see silence and assume satisfaction. They see commitment and assume love. But sometimes commitment and love are not the same thing. This is the story of how I stayed married long after I realized I was no longer in love out of fear, not hope. I told myself commitment mattered more than happiness, until the emptiness became unbearable. There was no affair, no screaming match, no dramatic betrayal. What happened was quieter than that. It was a gradual erosion, a slow thinning of something that once felt alive. I didn't wake up one morning and decide I had fallen out of love. It happened in small, almost polite increments. A conversation cut short, a need postponed, a truth swallowed. A version of myself folded smaller and smaller to fit into a shape that felt acceptable. And I stayed. I stayed because I was afraid of being selfish, afraid of being judged, afraid of starting over at an age when people begin asking about retirement accounts instead of reinvention. Most of all, I was afraid that maybe this was simply what long-term marriage becomes: quiet, practical, emotionally neutral. I told myself that passion is for movies, that stability is the real prize, that adults don't chase butterflies, they build foundations. But foundations without warmth become storage rooms. This story is not about revenge. It's not about exposing anyone. It's not about proving that I was right and someone else was wrong. My husband is not a villain. I am not a martyr. It's about what happens when you realize you've been living a life that looks solid but feels hollow. It's about the moment you understand that fear has been making your decisions for years. And it's about what quiet change really looks like. If you've ever stayed somewhere longer than your heart wanted to because leaving felt irresponsible or terrifying, then you might recognize parts of yourself in me. Have you ever convinced yourself that endurance was the same thing as love to my husband? I was dependable. That was the word he used most often when describing me to other people. Jade's dependable. She handles things. I don't have to worry when she's around. It was meant as a compliment. And for years, I wore it like one. At dinner parties, I was the woman refilling glasses before anyone noticed they were empty. At family gatherings, I remembered birthdays, dietary restrictions, and the correct way his mother liked her coffee. I knew the password to every account, the due date for every bill, and the expiration date on every document in our safe. I wasn't loud. I wasn't dramatic. I wasn't the kind of wife who made scenes or posted long captions about devotion. I was efficient, organized, present, invisible in all the ways that look responsible. My husband, Daniel, was warm and charming in public. People liked him instantly. He had a way of leaning into conversations that made others feel interesting. When we walked into a room together, eyes gravitated toward him. I stood slightly behind, smiling, watching. It wasn't that he pushed me back. I simply stepped there on my own. I told myself I preferred it that way. In our marriage, I was the stabilizer. When Daniel grew restless in his career, I recalculated our budget. When he wanted to explore a new opportunity, I adjusted timelines. When he felt misunderstood by a colleague, I listened without interrupting. I absorbed, I processed, I soothed. He would sometimes joke, "Jade's the strong one." I'd fall apart without her. Everyone laughed. So did I. But strength, when unexamined, can become a role rather than a reality. Over time, I noticed something subtle. When decisions were being made: vacations, investments, even what color to paint the living room, my input was welcomed, but not weighted. Daniel would ask my opinion, nod thoughtfully, and then choose what he already wanted. It wasn't hostile. It wasn't dismissive in a way anyone could easily point to. It was softer than that. He assumed I would adjust, and I did. I adjusted my schedule to fit his meetings. I adjusted my expectations to match his energy. I adjusted my tone when he seemed stressed. The adjustments were small enough that I didn't notice them stacking. They felt like a partnership, like compromise. When friends described us, they called us solid. That word again, solid. Not passionate, not deeply connected. Solid. I began to realize that solidity can sometimes mean something has stopped moving. In private moments, when Daniel scrolled through his phone beside me on the couch, our knees touching but our minds elsewhere, I would glance at him and try to locate the feeling I used to have, the quiet rush when he entered a room, the instinctive reach for his hand. Instead, I felt appreciation, respect, familiarity, but not longing, and I told myself that longing is immature, that marriages mature into something steadier, that fireworks are unsustainable. Still, there were evenings when I would sit at the kitchen table long after he'd gone to bed, my silver fountain pen in hand, journaling under the soft hum of the refrigerator. I wrote about work, about errands, about plans. I rarely wrote about us, because writing it down would have required naming it. To everyone around me, I was the ideal partner, low maintenance, emotionally intelligent, unwavering, the woman who doesn't make things harder than they need to be. But what they never saw was how much of myself I kept rearranging to maintain that image. Not because Daniel demanded it, because I believed that being easy to live with was the highest form of love. And somewhere along the way, I confused being needed with being cherished. I didn't feel unloved, I felt unchosen. There's a difference. One is loud and obvious, the other is quiet and gradual. And quiet things are easy to ignore, especially when you've built your identity around being the calm one. So I stayed in that role, the reliable wife, the composed presence, the woman who never asks for too much. Because if no one sees you struggling, then technically, nothing is wrong. Right, the first moment wasn't dramatic. There was no slamming door, no raised voice, no shocking confession. It happened on a Thursday evening in early autumn, the kind of Seattle night where the sky turns gray before you're ready for it to. Daniel and I had been invited to a networking dinner, hosted by one of his colleagues. It wasn't mandatory, but it mattered to him. So I adjusted my schedule, moved a late meeting, and met him at the restaurant downtown. I remember what I was wearing: a navy dress, simple but structured. I had chosen it carefully, not flashy, just polished. Supportive wife, polished. The dinner started the way they all did. Laughter, introductions, glasses clinking softly. Daniel slipped easily into conversation with the group, 3 men from his firm and their partners. I stood close enough to be included, far enough not to interrupt. At some point, the topic shifted to career growth and strategic planning. One of the men mentioned a stalled project and the frustration of navigating internal politics. I had managed similar dynamics at my own company, quietly, successfully. Daniel turned toward me and said, smiling, "Jade's the organized one. She loves spreadsheets. I'm more of the big picture guy." The table laughed lightly. It was harmless, almost affectionate, but something inside me paused. Because what he didn't say was that I led a department-wide transition the year before, that I negotiated contracts, that I had salvaged failing timelines and rebuilt trust with clients. He reduced me to the organized one, the spreadsheet wife. I smiled anyway. One of the partners asked what I did, and before I could answer fully, Daniel jumped in. "She keeps everything running smoothly. Honestly, she's the reason our house doesn't fall apart." Again, laughter. I nodded, let it pass. But I felt it. A thin, precise cut. Not because he insulted me, because he simplified me. On the drive home, rain tapping against the windshield, I considered mentioning it, not accusingly, just gently. Something like, "I wish you had talked about my work a little differently." But he seemed energized from the evening. He talked about potential promotions, about impressions made, about how important visibility was in his field. Visibility? The word echoed quietly in my mind. When we got home, he kissed my forehead and said, "Thanks for coming tonight. I know those things aren't really your scene." I almost corrected him. They were my scene. Strategy was my scene. Leadership was my scene. I navigated rooms like that every week, but I had been so practiced at supporting him that I had faded in my own outline. So I said, "Of course." Later that night, sitting at the kitchen table with my journal open, I replayed the dinner in detail, not obsessively, just carefully. It wasn't about ego. It wasn't about recognition. It was about erasure, the small assumption that my world was smaller, that my role was administrative, not intellectual, that I was there to steady him, not stand beside him. And here's the part that unsettled me most. No one else noticed. The other couples smiled, they nodded, they accepted the version of me that he presented. Why wouldn't they? It sounded reasonable, believable. Because I had allowed that version to exist, that was the first small cut, not what he said, but how easily it fit into the narrative we'd been building for years. I told myself it didn't matter, that it was just a social shorthand, that correcting him would make me seem sensitive or competitive. I told myself that strong women don't need public validation. And yet, as I closed my journal that night, I wrote a sentence I hadn't expected. I don't think he sees me clearly anymore. I didn't cry. I didn't confront him. I went to bed, but something had shifted, not loudly, not visibly, just enough that I couldn't unfeel it. Have you ever experienced a moment so small that no one else would remember it, but you knew, somehow, that it mattered after that dinner? Nothing exploded. There was no turning point montage, no sudden clarity. Life continued: morning alarms, shared coffee, separate commutes, polite texts about groceries. The rhythm of our marriage remained intact. But once you notice something, you start noticing it everywhere. The next time it happened, it was subtler. We were at brunch with two of Daniel's friends from college. They were reminiscing about their early careers, risk-taking, bold moves, the thrill of uncertainty. Daniel laughed and said, "I'm the risk-taker. Jade's the cautious one. She likes things safe." I smiled automatically. Safe. The word clung to me the rest of the afternoon. It wasn't entirely false. I valued planning. I believed in preparation. But I had also taken risks, accepting promotions that stretched me, leading high-stakes projects, advocating for changes that weren't popular. But those risks were strategic, quiet, not flashy. They didn't fit the narrative he preferred. And I realized something uncomfortable. I had participated in building that narrative. Whenever Daniel described himself as spontaneous and me as grounded, I nodded. Whenever he joked about my need for structure, I played along. It was easier than correcting him, easier than introducing complexity into rooms that preferred simple archetypes. He was the visionary. I was the anchor, and anchors don't drift. At home, the pattern deepened in smaller ways. If I brought up a long-term financial idea, adjusting investments, revisiting insurance policies, he would listen, then say, "We'll figure it out later." Later rarely came. If I suggested a weekend plan that didn't align with what he already had in mind, he would say, "Let's not overthink it." Overthinking. That became my new label. When I expressed emotional fatigue, "I feel like we don't really talk anymore," he would respond gently but dismissively, "You worry too much. We're fine. We're fine." It was never cruel, never sharp enough to protest, but it was cumulative. I started to notice how quickly I edited myself mid-sentence, how often I softened opinions before offering them, how frequently I reframed concerns as suggestions. I might be wrong, but maybe it's not a big deal. It's probably just me. It became a reflex. Not because Daniel silenced me overtly, because I had internalized that harmony required my flexibility. There's a specific loneliness in being married to someone who isn't unkind, but isn't curious either. Daniel didn't ask deeper follow-up questions about my work anymore. When I described a challenging leadership decision, he nodded distractedly, scrolling through his phone. If I paused, waiting for engagement, he would say, "Sorry, what were you saying?" And I would summarize, shorter this time. I told myself this was normal. Long-term couples settle into comfort. That constant emotional intensity is unrealistic, but comfort without attentiveness feels like fading. One night, I tested something small. I stopped volunteering solutions. When he complained about a stressful situation at work, I didn't immediately offer analysis. I just listened. He grew restless. "What do you think I should do?" he asked. And I realized he wasn't used to me being silent in that space. My usefulness had become expected. When I didn't perform it, there was a gap. That gap scared me, because if my primary value in our marriage was stability, what would happen if I stopped stabilizing? I began normalizing things that would have once unsettled me. Interrupted conversations. Assumptions made on my behalf. Decisions are announced rather than discussed. Each one is small enough to ignore. Each one reinforces a quiet hierarchy. He wasn't trying to diminish me, but he had grown accustomed to a version of me that took up less room. And I had grown accustomed to shrinking. There's a particular kind of heartbreak that doesn't involve betrayal. It involves gradual misalignment. The realization that someone you love has stopped seeing your full dimensions not because they hate you, but because they've become comfortable with a simplified version. And you helped create it. By the time I admitted to myself that I felt unseen, I had already trained him not to look. Have you ever realized that someone's misunderstanding of you wasn't intentional, but it was still your responsibility to correct? There's a moment in every long relationship when you realize you are no longer improvising. You are performing. I didn't wake up one day resentful. I woke up aware. It happened during something ordinary, a Sunday afternoon discussion about refinancing the house. I had spent 2 weeks researching interest rates, projecting long-term savings, and mapping out 3 different scenarios based on income fluctuation. I laid the printed documents on the dining table, neat and tabbed. Daniel glanced at them and said, half smiling, "You've already decided, haven't you?" The tone wasn't accusatory. It was playful, but underneath it was an assumption I handle the details. He approves or vetoes. I explained the options carefully. He listened for a few minutes, then leaned back in his chair. "Whatever you think is best," he said. It sounded like trust, but it didn't feel like a partnership, because whatever you think is best wasn't engagement. It was a delegation, emotional and logistical. That afternoon, I watched him return to his laptop while I gathered the papers, and it became uncomfortably clear. I was the infrastructure. I was the one who remembered, organized, absorbed, and anticipated. The one who managed extended family dynamics, the one who monitored expenses, the one who adjusted when his career required relocation discussions or longer hours. I wasn't just dependable, I was convenient. The realization didn't come with anger. It came with a strange stillness. At social events, I noticed the pattern more sharply. Daniel would talk expansively about future ambitions. People would admire his drive. When someone asked about our plans, he would say, "Jade keeps everything balanced." Balanced. The word sounded flattering, but balance implies you are holding something steady for someone else's movement. I began cataloging the invisible expectations. Be supportive but not competitive. Be intelligent but not intimidating. Be emotionally available but not emotionally demanding. Be stable but not stagnant. It was a narrow corridor to walk through, and I had walked it so well that no one questioned it, including me. One evening, as I folded laundry in the bedroom, Daniel came in and casually mentioned that he had committed us to a weekend trip with friends in 2 weeks. "I figured you'd be fine with it," he said. 2 weeks. I had already planned that weekend to finalize a proposal at work, something that could position me for a director-level role. I felt the reflex to say, "Of course." Instead, I paused. Not dramatically, just long enough to notice the impulse. "Actually," I said evenly, "I needed that weekend for something important." He looked surprised, not upset, just unaccustomed to resistance. "Oh, I didn't realize. I thought your schedule was flexible." Flexible? There it was again. My time, my ambitions, my priorities elastic by default. In that moment, I understood the role I had been assigned wasn't malicious. It was convenient for him and predictable for me. I had built a marriage where I was the reliable constant, the steady platform, the woman who made life smoother. But I had not built a marriage where I was actively pursued, deeply questioned, or fiercely chosen. There's a subtle grief in recognizing that someone loves the function you serve more than the fullness of who you are. And the hardest part, he didn't know he was doing it because I had made it so easy. That night, I lay in bed beside him, staring at the ceiling. I tried to remember the last time he had asked me not what I was managing, not what I was planning, but what I wanted. Not logistically, emotionally. I couldn't remember, and for the first time, the question formed without guilt. What if I am more than the role I've been performing? What if I stop performing it? The shift didn't happen during an argument. It didn't happen after a betrayal. It happened on a Tuesday morning at 6:12, standing in my kitchen, barefoot, holding a ceramic mug that had gone cold in my hands. Daniel had already left for an early meeting. The house was quiet in that particular way only early mornings can be, before emails, before expectations, before performance. I was staring at the window above the sink, rain pressed lightly against the glass, blurring the outline of the neighboring house. Everything looked softened, distant, and I felt something I hadn't allowed myself to name before. Emptiness. Not sadness, not rage, just an absence. I tried to summon affection the way you try to remember a scent. I thought about our wedding day, the way he had looked at me walking down the aisle, the warmth in his voice when he said my name back then. The memories were intact. The feeling wasn't. That's when the sentence surfaced with unnerving clarity. I am no longer in love with him. It didn't come with drama. It didn't shake me. It landed like a quiet fact. I waited for panic. Instead, I felt relief. Because for months, maybe longer, I had been trying to diagnose a discomfort I couldn't articulate. I had blamed stress, routine, adulthood, hormones, and burnout. Anything except the possibility that love had shifted into something flatter. I hadn't fallen out of respect. I hadn't fallen out of care. I hadn't fallen into hatred. I had fallen into neutrality, and neutrality in marriage is dangerous. I set the mug down and sat at the kitchen table. I didn't cry. I didn't spiral. I simply sat with the truth. I stayed married after realizing I was no longer in love out of fear, not hope, fear of dismantling a life that looked stable, fear of disappointing families, fear of being the woman who gave up, fear of discovering that maybe this was as good as it gets. I had always told myself commitment mattered more than happiness, that real love was a decision, not a feeling, that adults don't chase emotional highs, they honor vows. But sitting there, in the stillness of that morning, I had to confront something harder. Commitment without connection becomes endurance, and I was enduring my own marriage. I realized I had been treating my emotional needs like optional expenses, things to cut when budgets felt tight. I had prioritized practicality over presence, stability over intimacy. I had built a life optimized for security, but security without vitality feels like living in a beautifully furnished waiting room. I thought about telling Daniel that night. Imagine sitting across from him at the dinner table, calmly explaining that something fundamental had shifted inside me. But I knew I wouldn't, because this wasn't about him doing something wrong. It was about me waking up, and waking up is internal before it's external. So, instead of confronting him, I made a quieter decision. I would observe. I would stop forcing warmth where it didn't naturally rise. Stop manufacturing enthusiasm. Stop overcompensating for distance. Not as punishment, as data. If love were still there, it would reveal itself when I stopped performing it. If it wasn't, then I would have to face what that meant. That morning, as I washed the mug and placed it carefully on the drying rack, I felt something unfamiliar. Not heartbreak, clarity. And clarity, once it arrives, doesn't leave. Have you ever realized that the scariest truth wasn't losing someone, but admitting you already had after that Tuesday morning? I didn't change outwardly. I still packed lunches, still asked about his meetings, still remembered to schedule the HVAC maintenance and respond to his mother's texts. But internally, something had recalibrated. My silence was no longer automatic. It was intentional. There's a difference between swallowing your feelings because you're afraid of conflict and holding your words because you're gathering information. I began to notice how often I initiated affection, how frequently I bridged conversational gaps, how naturally I softened tense moments before they fully formed. So I stopped just slightly, not cold, not distant, just neutral. When Daniel came home and launched into a monologue about office politics, I listened without immediately analyzing. When he paused, expecting my usual strategic breakdown, I simply said, "That sounds frustrating." He blinked, waiting. I didn't elaborate. The silence stretched longer than he liked. "You don't have any advice?" he asked. "I'm sure you'll figure out what's best," I replied gently. The words weren't sharp. They were the exact tone he had used with me many times before. "Whatever you think is best." I watched him sit with his own uncertainty instead of outsourcing it to me. Not to teach him a lesson, but to see what happened when I stopped filling every emotional space. At night, I no longer reached for his hand first. If he reached for mine, I responded. If he didn't, I would let the distance remain. The first week, nothing dramatic shifted. The second week, he grew slightly restless. "Are you tired lately?" he asked one evening. "You seem quieter." "I've just been thinking." I said. That was true. Thinking about how much of our dynamic relied on my emotional labor. Thinking about how often I translated feelings into solutions, so he didn't have to sit in discomfort. When I stopped doing that, he felt the absence not consciously, but subtly. Silence has weight when someone is used to you carrying it for them. He mistook my quiet for stress at first, then for distraction. Once, jokingly, he asked if I was mad about something. "I'm not mad," I answered calmly, and I wasn't. That was the surprising part. Anger would have been easier. Anger gives you energy, direction. What I felt was distance. And distance doesn't demand confrontation. It demands evaluation. In meetings at work, I was still decisive, still articulate. My voice hadn't disappeared, it had simply been redistributed. I began journaling differently. Two, instead of documenting tasks, I tracked patterns. How many times did he ask about my day without checking his phone? How often did he initiate emotional conversation when I didn't smooth over the tension? Did he notice it? The answers weren't devastating. They were illuminating. He wasn't cruel. He was comfortable. Comfortable enough to assume I would always lean in first. The more I stepped back, the more I realized how asymmetrical our emotional effort had become. And yet, I didn't confront him because I wasn't sure what I wanted yet. I wasn't preparing to leave. I was preparing to see clearly. There's a quiet power in choosing silence not as submission, but as observation. When you stop explaining yourself constantly, when you stop cushioning others from your absence, when you stop performing warmth to maintain stability, you begin to see who reaches toward you and who simply waits for you to return to your role. Daniel waited, not maliciously, not intentionally. He just assumed I would recalibrate back to the version of me he recognized. But I didn't, and for the first time in years, my silence felt less like invisibility and more like control. Have you ever stopped giving more than you were receiving, just to see what would happen when people imagine a marriage unraveling? They picture arguments, raised voices, slammed doors, ultimatums. But what they don't picture is a woman sitting at her desk on a Wednesday night, reviewing retirement account statements with the same calm precision she uses at work. Preparation rarely looks dramatic. It looks like spreadsheets. After my silence became intentional, I didn't rush into decisions. I didn't call a lawyer. I didn't confide in friends. I studied. Not him, the structure. I began reviewing our financial architecture not because I was planning to leave immediately, but because I needed to understand the foundation of my life independently of him. I had always managed our accounts. I knew the numbers, but now I looked at them differently. What was jointly held? What was individually owned? What would stability look like alone? I increased my contributions to my personal savings quietly, not secretly, just independently. I restructured a few investments to ensure liquidity if I ever needed it. Daniel didn't notice. Why would he? He trusted me with the details. At work, I leaned further into visibility. I volunteered for a cross-department initiative that required public presentations. I accepted invitations to industry panels I would have declined before to preserve weekend harmony. For years, I had calibrated my ambition around our shared rhythm. Now, I calibrated it around my own. No announcements, no declarations, just alignment. At home, I continued observing. I stopped reminding him of small things that only affected him: deadlines, follow-ups, forgotten commitments. When a friend texted him directly about a plan he had half promised, I didn't intercept or manage it. He stumbled once or twice, nothing catastrophic, just minor inconveniences. And for the first time, he felt the friction I had been absorbing for years. I wasn't punishing him. I was redistributing responsibility. There's a difference. In my journal, the tone changed. My entries were less about confusion and more about assessment. If I left, what would I miss? If I stayed, what would I lose? The answers surprised me. If I left, I would miss familiarity, shared jokes, the comfort of knowing someone's history without explanation. If I stayed, I would lose momentum, vitality, the possibility of being fully seen. That realization didn't make me bitter. It made me strategic. I began documenting not wrongdoing, not evidence of betrayal, but patterns: emotional disengagement, financial contributions, household labor distribution. Not because I anticipated a fight, because clarity requires records. Daniel remained largely unaware of the internal recalibration happening beside him. He interpreted my increased work visibility as a busy season. He interpreted my independence as maturity. He even complimented me once. "You've been really focused lately. It's impressive." I smiled. He thought I was becoming more aligned with him. In reality, I was becoming more aligned with myself. And that subtle shift changed the energy of everything. There's something powerful about preparing quietly, No grand speeches, no threats, no visible cracks, just a woman steadily repositioning her life. Friends still described us as solid. My family still asked about holiday plans as if nothing had changed. Because externally, nothing had, but internally, I was no longer staying out of fear alone. I was gathering leverage not over him, but over my own uncertainty. The more prepared I became, the less trapped I felt. And the less trapped I felt, the more honest I could be with myself. The truth was no longer terrifying. It was logistical. Have you ever realized that the moment you start preparing for independence, you've already stepped beyond dependence? The revelation didn't arrive in a courtroom. It didn't come through a secret discovery or a dramatic confession. It came through numbers, specifically. A quiet Tuesday evening when I logged into our long-term financial dashboard and reviewed 10 years of data side by side. I had been tracking patterns for months: income contributions, investment growth, asset allocations, retirement trajectories. I wasn't searching for wrongdoing. I was searching for reality. And reality, when organized clearly, can be sobering. For most of our marriage, Daniel's income had been higher than mine, at least on paper. But as I traced promotions, bonuses, equity shares, and compound growth, something became clear. My financial discipline had built the majority of our long-term stability. The refinance I insisted on 5 years earlier, it saved us 6 figures over time. I structured a diversified portfolio allocation during market volatility. It preserved capital when others panicked. The emergency fund I quietly expanded. It insulated us during one of his stalled career transitions. He earned wealth, but I optimized, and optimization compounds. The numbers didn't make me triumphant, they made me calm. For years, a part of me had feared that leaving would mean instability, that I would be the one absorbing risk, that I would be stepping into financial vulnerability at 36. But that night, staring at clean, unemotional data, I realized something powerful. I was not dependent. I had built security with my own hands. The fear that had kept me still wasn't rooted in logistics. It was rooted in identity. Who was I if not the reliable wife? Who was I if not the stabilizer? Who was I if I chose my own emotional clarity over the appearance of endurance? That was the real question. Not whether I could survive alone, but whether I could redefine myself. I opened my journal and wrote a single sentence. I am staying because I am afraid of change, not because I am incapable of it. That distinction changed everything, because fear loses authority once it's named. Over the following weeks, I met quietly with a financial advisor, not to initiate separation, but to review personal strategy. I framed it as long-term planning, which, technically, it was. I wanted to understand what my life could look like if it were entirely self-directed. The advisor reviewed my accounts and said something simple. You've positioned yourself very well. Positioned. The word lingered. I wasn't trapped. I was positioned, emotionally uncertain but strategically strong. That night, Daniel and I sat on the couch as usual. A show played in the background. He laughed at something on his phone and showed me a meme. I laughed politely, and I realized something with quiet certainty. The love I felt for him had transformed into familiarity. And familiarity is not enough to sustain a marriage indefinitely. There was no hatred in me, no urge to expose or punish. Only clarity. The private reveal wasn't about leverage over him. It was about leveraging my own hesitation. For the first time since that Tuesday morning in the kitchen, I felt something steady return. Not passion, not longing, but confidence. If I chose to leave, it would not be reckless. It would be deliberate. And if I chose to stay, it would no longer be because I was afraid. The power was not in confrontation. It was in knowing I had options. And once a woman knows she has options, her energy changes even if no one else can see it yet. Have you ever discovered that the cage you feared leaving was never locked? Clarity doesn't force action. It invites it. For weeks after the financial review, I didn't make any visible changes. I went to work. I came home. I asked Daniel about his day. We attended a friend's birthday dinner and stood side by side in photos that looked perfectly normal. If someone had asked me then whether I was unhappy, I would have hesitated. Unhappy felt too dramatic. I wasn't suffering. I was detached. And detachment is dangerous because it doesn't demand urgency. But inside, I had reached a decision point not about leaving, but about honesty. I gave myself 3 options. Option 1, stay exactly as we were. Accept that love had softened into companionship, Optimize the logistics, build a stable, emotionally moderate life. Many couples do this. There's no scandal in it. Option 2. Initiate repair. Sit Daniel down and explain everything. The erosion, the neutrality, the fear, propose therapy. Rebuild intentionally. Risk of discovering that what was gone couldn't be resurrected. Option 3. Leave, not impulsively, not angrily, but decisively. Accept that sometimes two good people are no longer aligned in the way marriage requires. For several nights, I mentally rehearsed conversations for each path. If I stayed, I would have to bury something fundamental. Not loudly, just quietly, permanently. If I tried to repair, I would have to be brutally honest about something he hadn't realized was broken. I would have to risk hurting him deeply, and I wasn't certain my heart was invested enough to fight for revival. If I left, I would dismantle a life that worked on paper. That was the weight of it. Nothing was on fire. Nothing was abusive. Nothing was catastrophic. It would be easier if it were. Instead, I had to choose between comfort and authenticity. The decision crystallized one evening when Daniel came home excited about a potential relocation opportunity. Another city, bigger title, more visibility. He talked for 15 minutes straight, outlining possibilities, schools, housing markets, networking circles. At some point, he paused and said, "You'd be okay with that." "Right. You're flexible." Flexible? I felt the word land differently this time. In the past, I would have started calculating cost of living, commute times, career implications for me. I would have shifted into supportive analysis mode. Instead, I heard myself ask quietly, "Have you thought about what that move would mean for my career?" He blinked, genuinely surprised. "Well, you could probably find something. You're good at adapting." Adapting. In that moment, the choice became clear. If I stayed without redefining the dynamic, I would continue adapting to his expansion. And I was tired of orbiting someone else's growth. Not resentful, just tired. That night, lying in bed beside him, I felt a strange calm settle over me. I didn't need to rush. I didn't need to accuse. But I knew the irreversible option was the only one aligned with who I was becoming. Leaving wasn't about rejecting him. It was about reclaiming myself. I had spent years telling myself commitment mattered more than happiness. But commitment without mutual evolution becomes stagnation, and I could no longer pretend stagnation was noble. The decision wasn't loud. It was internal. I would leave. Not tomorrow. Not dramatically. But deliberately, because staying out of fear is not loyalty. It's avoidance. And I was done avoiding my own truth. Have you ever realized that the hardest decision isn't choosing between good and bad, but choosing between familiar and honest once I decided? The urgency disappeared. That may sound strange, but when you've been living in internal conflict for months, sometimes years, the moment you choose a direction, your nervous system softens. There is no more debate, only execution. I didn't announce anything. I began with logistics. First, I met with a family law attorney during a long lunch break. I didn't frame it as I'm leaving my husband. I framed it as I need to understand my options. The attorney asked careful questions: length of marriage, assets, income disparities, and property ownership. I answered calmly, with organized documentation already prepared. At the end of the meeting, she said, "You've kept excellent records. That will make things smoother." Smoother? I wasn't looking for an advantage. I was looking for dignity. I wanted any transition to be clean, respectful, grounded in fairness. Next, I opened a separate checking account in my name only, not secret, simply autonomous. My salary deposits were redirected quietly. Joint obligations continued to be paid from shared accounts as usual. Nothing outwardly changed. At home, I maintained the rhythm. I still cooked dinner twice a week, still sat beside him on the couch, still discussed neutral topics. But internally, I was detaching in measured increments. I began apartment research, not because I intended to move immediately, but because I needed to see tangible alternatives. I toured 2 places under the pretense of helping a colleague. I imagined my furniture in smaller spaces, my morning routine without shared footsteps. It didn't feel tragic. It felt spacious. Daniel remained unaware of the timeline forming quietly beside him. He talked more about the relocation opportunity. He assumed we were moving as a unit. Each time he said I felt the word shift in meaning. At work, I leaned into leadership with greater visibility. I finalized a proposal that positioned me for a promotion independent of geographic relocation. I built professional references intentionally, strengthened networks. If I were leaving a marriage, I would not leave my trajectory uncertain. There's a misconception that decisive women act emotionally. In truth, decisive women act systematically. I wasn't fueled by anger. I wasn't trying to win. I was designing an exit that preserved integrity for both of us. One evening, Daniel mentioned signing a preliminary document for the potential move. They want an answer soon, he said casually, but I told them we'd talk about it. I looked at him carefully. For the first time in years, I didn't feel pulled into his momentum. I think we need to have a different kind of conversation before we decide anything, I said. He frowned slightly. About what? About us. The word hung there. He didn't push. He assumed it was a minor discussion about logistics. He didn't realize it was the beginning of an ending. That night, after he fell asleep, I sat at the kitchen table with my silver fountain pen and wrote the outline of what I would say when the time came. Not accusations, not grievances, just truth. I no longer feel in love. I stayed out of fear. I don't want to keep living in quiet neutrality. As I closed the journal, I felt something unexpected. Grief but not panic. Because when you move in silence, you give yourself time to metabolize the ending before it becomes public. And that makes all the difference. Have you ever noticed that by the time a calm person speaks, they've already processed everything? The first consequence wasn't dramatic. It was subtle, like a shift in air pressure before a storm. After I told Daniel we needed to talk about us, he became more attentive. Not in a sweeping, romantic way. In small, observable adjustments. He asked about my day and waited for a full answer. He put his phone down during dinner more often. He suggested a weekend hike, just the two of us. If this had happened 6 months earlier, I might have felt hopeful. Instead, I felt analytical, not cold, just aware. When someone senses distance, they often try to restore equilibrium. Daniel wasn't panicking yet. He was recalibrating, trying to locate what had shifted. "You've seemed different lately," he said one night, his tone careful, quieter. "I've been thinking," I replied again. He searched my face, as if trying to decode a language he hadn't studied before. The truth was, he felt the withdrawal not as rejection, but as loss of infrastructure. The house still ran smoothly, bills were still paid, schedules still aligned, but the emotional cushioning had thinned. When he vented about work, I didn't instinctively reassure him that he was right. I asked neutral questions instead. What outcome do you want? How do you think that will affect your team? He wasn't used to solving things without my emotional framing. At a friend's gathering, someone joked about how solid our marriage was. Daniel smiled automatically, then glanced at me as if checking whether I would echo the sentiment. I smiled politely, but I didn't reinforce it. That microsecond of hesitation unsettled him more than any argument would have. Over the next week, he became more affectionate. A hand on my lower back while walking into a room. A spontaneous coffee was brought to my desk on a Saturday morning. They were gestures he had once done naturally, then gradually stopped. Now they felt responsive, not originating from desire but from detection. One evening, he asked directly, "Are you unhappy?" The question hung between us. I could have softened it, redirected, said, "I'm just tired." Instead, I chose precision. "I'm not unhappy," I said calmly. "I'm disconnected." He went quiet. Disconnected is harder to argue with than unhappy. Unhappy suggests something to fix, a mood to adjust, a problem to solve. Disconnected suggests distance already traveled. "I didn't realize you felt that way," he said after a moment, and I believed him. He hadn't realized, because I had made sure he didn't have to. That was the consequence unfolding, not chaos, but recognition. He began revisiting old memories, mentioning our early years, suggesting trips, floating the idea of counseling just to strengthen things. It wasn't desperation yet. It was confusion. Something was slipping, and he couldn't locate when it started. But I knew it started with small cuts, simplifications, assumptions. It started when I began shrinking, and it solidified the day I stopped. The most difficult part wasn't watching him notice. It was feeling how little those renewed efforts stirred inside me. There was appreciation, there was sadness, but there wasn't ignition. And that told me more than any argument could have. Consequences don't always arrive as punishment. Sometimes they arrive as awareness too late to restore what quietly faded. Have you ever watched someone try to fix something and realize you had already stepped beyond repair? Panic doesn't always look like shouting. Sometimes it looks like urgency wrapped in calm. After I said the word disconnected, Daniel changed. Not aggressively, not defensively, intentionally. He scheduled a reservation at the restaurant where we had our first anniversary dinner. He suggested couples therapy without irony. He began referencing us with more weight, as if the word itself required reinforcement. At first, I admired the effort. He wasn't dismissing me. He wasn't minimizing my feelings. He was trying. But there's a painful truth about timing. Effort matters most before detachment becomes clarity. One evening, we sat across from each other at that anniversary restaurant. Same dim lighting, same corner table, a violinist in the background. He reached across the table and took my hand. I didn't realize how much you were carrying, he said quietly. If I've taken you for granted, I'm sorry. It was sincere. I could see it in his eyes. And that's what made it harder, because I wasn't angry anymore. Anger could have fueled repair. Anger implies heat. What I felt was distance. I don't think you meant to, I replied honestly. He exhaled, relieved that I wasn't attacking him. We can fix this, he said. Whatever it is, we can fix it. There it was. The assumption that everything is solvable if you apply enough effort, and maybe that's true for logistics. But love isn't a broken appliance. It's an ecosystem, and ours had slowly dried out. The next few weeks intensified. He initiated deeper conversations, asked about my dreams, my frustrations, my emotional needs, questions he hadn't asked in years. The problem wasn't the questions. It was that my answers no longer carried urgency. When he held me at night, I felt the embrace as pressure, not warmth. When he suggested a weekend getaway to reconnect, I agreed, but the anticipation wasn't there. I watched him trying to rediscover me, but I had already rediscovered myself, and the version of me he was reaching for no longer existed. One night, after therapy session number 2, he said in the car, I feel like I'm finally seeing things clearly. I looked out the window at passing streetlights and thought, so am I, but clarity doesn't guarantee alignment. He began asking for reassurance. Do you still love me? Is this just a phase? Are you thinking about leaving? The last question lingered longer than the others. I didn't answer immediately, because silence was no longer a strategy. It was honesty forming. I don't know if love is the right word for what I feel anymore, I said carefully. The air shifted. Not explosive, not violent, heavy. He looked forward, jaw tightening slightly, not in anger, but in disbelief. I didn't know it was that serious, he whispered. It had always been that serious. It just wasn't loud. The tragedy of quiet erosion is that by the time one person recognizes it, the other may already be past the point of return. He wasn't a villain scrambling to save his comfort. He was a husband realizing he had missed something essential, and I was a wife realizing she had already grieved the marriage privately. Repair requires two people standing at the same emotional distance from the problem. We weren't. He had just arrived at the starting line. I was nearing the exit. Have you ever been offered everything you once wanted and realized you no longer wanted it? The conversation happened on a Sunday afternoon. No storm outside, no dramatic soundtrack. Just filtered light through the living room windows and the faint hum of the dishwasher in the background. I chose that day deliberately. Not because it was symbolic, but because it was calm. Daniel was sitting on the couch, laptop closed for once, waiting. He knew this wasn't a minor check-in. I sat across from him, not beside him. That distance mattered. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence wasn't hostile. It was weighted. I've been thinking a lot, I began. My voice was steady, not rehearsed. Just certain. And I need to say this clearly. He nodded once. I stayed in this marriage because I believe in commitment. I continued. Even when things felt off. Even when I started feeling disconnected. His eyes flickered at that word again. I told myself commitment mattered more than happiness. That stability was enough. But over time, the emptiness became unbearable. I didn't cry. I didn't raise my voice. I simply told the truth. I'm not angry at you. I said, you didn't betray me. You didn't hurt me intentionally. But somewhere along the way, we stopped choosing each other in the same way. He inhaled sharply, but didn't interrupt. I changed. I admitted. I shrank. I adapted. I took on a role that made everything smooth, but it didn't make me feel seen, and I didn't correct it soon enough. His jaw tightened not defensively, but as if bracing for impact. Are you saying you want to leave? He asked quietly. There it was, direct. Yes, I answered. No hesitation. Not because it was easy, because it was true. He looked at me for a long time, searching for anger, for accusation, for something to push against, but there was nothing sharp to resist. I've been trying, he said, not pleading, just stating. I know, I replied, and I respect that. But I realized something important. I paused not for drama, but precision. You're trying to rebuild something I already finished grieving. The words didn't land like a weapon. They landed like finality. He leaned back slowly, as if absorbing a physical blow. So there's nothing I can do, he asked. The question wasn't about logistics. It was about hope. I think we waited too long to ask the right questions. I said gently, and I don't want to stay out of fear anymore. No shouting, no insults, just two adults sitting in the quiet aftermath of truth. He rubbed his hands together, staring at the floor. I didn't see it happening, he admitted. I know, I said again. That was the tragedy of it. Nothing catastrophic had happened. We had simply drifted, one accommodating, the other assuming. And by the time we noticed, the emotional gap was no longer bridgeable. We discussed logistics after that calmly, timelines, living arrangements, the relocation offer he would now consider independently. It felt surreal, how procedural it became. But that's what happens when confrontation carries no heat. It carries clarity. As the sun shifted lower in the sky, casting longer shadows across the room, I felt something unexpected. Not triumph, not devastation, relief, because for the first time in years, I wasn't performing steadiness. I was living in it. Have you ever ended something not because it was toxic, but because it was no longer alive? It has been a year since that Sunday afternoon, a year since I sat across from Daniel and chose honesty over endurance. I live in a smaller apartment now, 2 bedrooms, wide windows, morning light that reaches all the way to the kitchen counter. The first night I slept there, the silence felt unfamiliar, not heavy, just different. There is a particular kind of quiet that follows a decision made without chaos. It's not the silence of loss. It's the silence of space. In the beginning, I expected to feel loneliness like a sharp edge. Instead, what I felt was expansion. My routines became entirely mine. My evenings no longer calibrated around someone else's energy. My weekends unfolded without negotiation. At work, I accepted the promotion I had once hesitated to pursue. The visibility I had cautiously stepped into became natural. I speak in rooms now without shrinking my language. I offer ideas without prefacing them with disclaimers. Not because I am louder, because I am no longer minimizing myself. Daniel moved to the new city. We finalized the divorce respectfully. No public spectacle, no legal battles, just signatures and transitions. We speak occasionally logistically, politely. There is no hostility between us, only distance is shaped by different directions. For a while, people asked, "Are you happier?" The question always felt incomplete. Happiness is not a constant state. It rises and falls. What I am now is aligned. Aligned with my values, aligned with my ambitions, aligned with my emotional truth. And alignment brings a steadier kind of peace than happiness ever could. I no longer describe myself as the dependable one. I am dependable to myself. That is different. I've learned that strength is not silent endurance. It is a measured action. It is recognizing when loyalty to others has eclipsed loyalty to your own interior life. There are evenings when I sit by the window with my silver fountain pen and journal the way I used to, but the entries are different now. They are not about managing, they are about imagining. I don't resent my marriage. It taught me discipline, partnership, and responsibility. It taught me the cost of shrinking. It taught me that fear can masquerade as virtue. Most importantly, it taught me that leaving calmly is not cruel. It is clarity. I am not a woman who burned down her life. I am a woman who redesigned it. And there is a quiet dominance in that choosing yourself without drama, without revenge, without spectacle, just truth. Have you ever realized that becoming yourself fully sometimes requires letting go of the version of you others found comfortable? If there is one thing I've learned through all of this, it's this. Staying is not always noble. Leaving is not always selfish. Sometimes the bravest choice is the quiet one no one applauds. For years, I told myself that endurance was proof of love, that if I could just be patient enough, adaptable enough, steady enough, The emptiness would eventually transform back into connection. But love does not regenerate simply because you refuse to examine its absence. And fear of judgment, fear of instability, fear of starting over can disguise itself as maturity. I stayed married after realizing I was no longer in love out of fear, not hope. And the most difficult part wasn't admitting that to my husband. It was admitting it to myself. What I understand now is this: commitment is powerful, but commitment without mutual awareness becomes quite self-abandonment. There was no villain in my story, no dramatic betrayal, just two people who slowly stopped meeting each other in the middle. The lesson wasn't about choosing independence over partnership. It was about choosing alignment over appearance, because a life that looks solid from the outside can still feel hollow on the inside, and no one else can feel that hollowness for you. If you are in a place where you are enduring instead of connecting, if you're telling yourself that stability should be enough, if you're afraid to even ask whether you're still in love, I won't tell you to leave, I won't tell you to stay, but I will ask you this: are you choosing your life from fear or from truth? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever stayed longer than your heart wanted to because it felt responsible? Or have you ever left something that looked perfect on paper because it no longer felt alive? Let's talk about it.